how brothers killed brothers, and how the Imperium became the nightmare it swore to destroy. What happens when the chosen son decides he deserves to be God? The galaxy burned long before the heresy. Terra had already died 1,000 times. Radiation storms scoured the wastelands. Techno-barbarian warlords ruled over shattered hive cities built upon older ruins, themselves raised on the bones of civilizations whose names had been forgotten before the first starships left the cradle. Humanity had touched the stars and been cast back down into the mud. The Age of Strife was not a single catastrophe but a slow extinction, stretched across millennia, where every generation inherited less than the one before. By the time the Emperor revealed himself, there was almost nothing left to save. He emerged from obscurity with no herald and no scripture. The records do not agree on where he came from or how long he had walked among humanity unseen. What is known is this: he possessed knowledge that should not have existed, technology that predated the fall, and a will that could not be broken. He was not the first warlord to promise unity. He was simply the first who could not be stopped. The unification wars were not glorious. They were systematic. One by one, the petty kings and gene tyrants of Terra were broken or bent to his purpose. Some joined willingly, seduced by the promise of order. Others resisted and were erased so thoroughly that only their absence remained. The Thunder Warriors were his instrument in those days, gene-forged warriors of terrible strength and unstable biology, created not to endure but to conquer. They swept across the irradiated plains and storm-shattered mountains, leaving compliance or ashes in their wake. They were brutal because brutality was required. They were loyal because they had been designed to be. When the last fortress fell and the final warlord knelt, Terra was unified for the first time in recorded history. The Emperor stood at the center of a world remade, its people bound not by faith but by force and the promise of survival. He called it the Imperium of Man. He declared it would be a secular empire, founded on reason and the imperial truth. There were no gods, no spirits, no powers beyond the material. Humanity would be guided by science and order, freed from the superstitions that had led it into darkness. The Thunder Warriors were no longer needed. They were purged quietly, without ceremony or explanation. Some died in their last battles, spent like ammunition. Others were executed in the mountains of Ararat, their service rewarded with erasure. A few survived long enough to realize what had been done to them, but not long enough to matter. The Emperor had already moved on to his next creation. The Thunder Warriors had been a prototype. The Legiones Astartes would be the perfected instrument. 20 Primarchs were wrought in the Emperor's hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, gene-forged demigods crafted from his own essence and the deepest secrets of the warp. They were to be generals, administrators, exemplars of human potential elevated beyond mortal limitation. Each was designed with a purpose, a role within the grand architecture of the Imperium yet to come. They were not merely soldiers but living symbols, embodiments of virtue and function intended to inspire and command across the breadth of the galaxy. The powers of the warp saw what he had made and stole them. The laboratory was breached not by armies but by the raw unreality of the Imperium, and the infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy like seeds cast into a storm. The Emperor's grand design was broken before it could begin. What should have been raised in his image, taught and guided, was instead cast into the unknown. 20 sons lost, 20 futures rewritten by forces that understood the Emperor's plan better than he had understood their reach. He did not despair. He began the Great Crusade. The Legiones Astartes were created from the genetic template of the absent Primarchs, gene seed harvested and implanted into mortal recruits to transform them into transhuman warriors. 20 legions, each bearing the legacy of a father they had never known. They were slower to produce than the Thunder Warriors, more stable, more precise. They were built to fight, not for decades but for centuries, to carry the Imperium's banner across the stars and hold what they conquered. The Emperor took command of the first expeditionary fleets and launched humanity outward into a galaxy that had forgotten it. The Great Crusade was expansion and reclamation in equal measure. Humanity had once held 10,000 worlds. Most had fallen silent during the Age of Strife, isolated by warp storms and the collapse of interstellar travel. Some had regressed to feudalism or barbarism. Others had thrived in isolation and did not welcome reunification. The Crusade did not ask for permission. It offered compliance or annihilation. Xeno-species that occupied human worlds were purged without negotiation. Human cultures that resisted the imperial truth were conquered and re-educated. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was necessity rendered absolute, and the Emperor found his sons. One by one, across decades of war and exploration, the Primarchs were recovered from the worlds where they had crashed as infants. Each had survived impossible odds. Each had risen to prominence on their adopted homeworlds, becoming warlords, kings, saviors, or monsters depending on the culture that had shaped them. They were reunited with the legions that bore their gene seed, and the Crusade accelerated. The Primarchs were everything the Emperor had intended. Brilliant tacticians, charismatic leaders, transhuman paragons who could inspire mortals and command Astartes with equal ease. Horus was the first to be found. He had been raised on the gang-ruled mining world of Chthoniya, a planet hollowed out by centuries of exploitation, its population brutal and pragmatic. Horus had clawed his way to the surface through cunning and charisma, uniting the gangs beneath his banner before the Emperor's fleet arrived. The reunion was said to have been immediate and absolute. Horus was given command of the 16th Legion, renamed the Lunar Wolves, in honor of their first great victory. He fought at the Emperor's side longer than any of his brothers, learned the art of war and governance directly from the architect of the Imperium, and earned the love and respect of every legion he fought beside. Lemon Russ was recovered from the frozen death world of Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and crowned king of barbarian tribes. Feral, proud, and unyielding, he became the Emperor's executioner, the one sent to break those who could not be reasoned with. Rogel Dawn was found on the ice world of Inwit, a stoic fortress builder whose sense of duty was absolute. He fortified worlds as quickly as others conquered them. Sanguinius was discovered on the rad-blasted moon of Baal, an angel with wings of white and a vision of his own death that he never spoke of. His legion became the Blood Angels, beloved and beautiful, and touched by a flaw they could not name. Ferrus Manus, whose hands had been transformed into living metal by his homeworld's strange technology. Fulgrim, perfect in form and ambition, who sought mastery in all things. Vulcan, who valued the lives of common humans when so many of his brothers saw only resources. Corvus Corax, a liberator who had overthrown tyrants and carried the weight of every shadow. Robot Gilliman, a statesman and logistician who built empires as easily as others waged war. The Lion, silent and secretive, whose loyalty was absolute even as his trust was measured and cold. Each was a miracle. Each was flawed. Konrad Kurze had been raised in the darkness of Nostramo, a world of crime and murder, and he had become its avenging nightmare. His methods were terror and atrocity, and he believed them just. Angron had been a slave and a gladiator, forced to fight for the amusement of masters he despised. When the Emperor found him, Angron had been leading a doomed rebellion, and instead of saving his companions, the Emperor had taken him and left them to die. Angron never forgave that. The butcher's nails archaeotech implants driven into his brain by his former captors turned his life into an endless cascade of pain and rage. Lorgar had been raised on the desert world of Kolkis, a culture steeped in religious devotion. He worshipped the Emperor not as a man but as a god, and when the imperial truth reached his world, he twisted it into scripture. He spread the faith of the god Emperor across every world he conquered, building monuments and cathedrals where others built fortresses and supply lines. For decades the Emperor allowed it, and Lorgar believed his devotion was welcomed. Magnus the Red was found on the planet of sorcerers, Prospero, a world of psychers and scholars who had survived the Age of Strife through mastery of the warp. Magnus was the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, second only to the Emperor himself. He saw the warp not as a threat but as a tool to be understood and harnessed. He believed that knowledge was the highest virtue and that ignorance was humanity's greatest enemy. The Emperor had forbidden the use of sorcery, but Magnus believed he knew better. Mortarion had been raised on the toxic death world of Barbarus, where human settlements cowered in the valleys while alien overlords ruled the poisoned peaks. He had climbed higher than any human before, killed his adoptive father, a creature of warp-born horror, and freed his people through endurance and spite. He despised the warp and all who touched it. He despised weakness. He despised dependence. Perturabo had been found on Olympia, a world of logic and cold reason, and he had become its greatest architect and general. But he had been undervalued, always given the sieges no one else wanted, the grinding campaigns with no glory and no thanks. He built fortresses and tore them down, and he resented every moment. The Emperor loved them all, or so it seemed. He gave them legions, fleets, worlds to govern. He called them his sons, and spoke of a future where they would stand beside him as rulers of a united galaxy. For a time, it was enough. The Great Crusade burned across the galaxy like a cleansing fire. Thousands of worlds were brought into compliance. Xenos empires were shattered. The Orc hordes of Ulanor, one of the greatest concentrations of greenskin power ever recorded, were annihilated in a campaign of such scale and coordination that it became the defining moment of the Crusade's success. Horus commanded the final assault personally, and when the war was won, the Emperor Jargi his sons, and the assembled commanders of the Imperium, to the conquered world for a triumph unlike any before. It was there, upon the ashes of Ulanor, that the Emperor named Horus Warmaster. The title was unprecedented. Horus would command not just his own legion but all the expeditionary fleets, all the Primarchs, the entire military apparatus of the Imperium. He would be the Emperor's voice in the field, his authority made manifest. The other Primarchs bowed and acknowledged the honor, though the weight of it settled unevenly among them. Some, like Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn, saw it as right and proper Horus had earned it. Others, like Perturabo and the Lion, felt the sting of being passed over. Fulgrim smiled and offered congratulations, but something in him shifted. Lorgar saw divine confirmation. Magnus wondered why ambition should be rewarded above wisdom, and the Emperor, having elevated his favorite son above all others, withdrew. He returned to Terra and sequestered himself within the Imperial Palace, vanishing into laboratories and vaults deep beneath the Himalaysian peaks. He offered no explanation to his sons, only instructions to continue the crusade in his name. Horus was left to command the greatest war machine in human history, while his father disappeared into silence. The word-bearers were told to cease building monuments. The 1,000 Sons were warned that their pursuit of psychic knowledge bordered on heresy. The Emperor's absence was not gradual, it was abrupt and total. A door closed without farewell. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, tried to explain. "The Webway project," he said, "a secret work of such magnitude that it required the Emperor's full attention. Humanity would be freed from reliance on the warp for travel, insulated from the predations of chaos, given access to the ancient tunnels that the Eldar had once used to cross the galaxy in safety. It was the final piece of the Emperor's vision, the infrastructure that would allow the Imperium to endure for millennia. But the Primarchs were not told this in full. They were given vague assurances and left to wonder why their father had abandoned them at the height of their triumph. Horus carried the weight alone. He commanded with skill and honor, prosecuting campaigns across the galaxy, managing the egos and ambitions of his brothers, holding the Imperium together through force of personality and brilliance. He was beloved by the legions, respected even by those Primarchs who resented the Emperor's choice. He succeeded in every task given to him, and he began to wonder if success was enough. The Crusade had been sold as a mission of enlightenment and unity, but the worlds brought into compliance were not free. They were taxed, tithed, garrisoned, and stripped of independence. The imperial truth forbade religion, but the Imperium demanded worship of its own institutions. The Administratum consumed entire planets in bureaucracy. The Iterators preached conformity. Horus saw that what they were building was not a republic of reason, but an empire of control, and he had been made its enforcer. He did not speak these doubts aloud. Not yet. The lodges began among the Astartes as simple warrior fraternities, places where rank was set aside and brotherhood could be affirmed. They spread through the legions quietly, dismissed as harmless tradition. In truth, they were something else, meeting places where dissent could be voiced in private, where questions about the Emperor's vision and the Imperium's future could be asked without censure. Erebus, first chaplain of the word-bearers, moved among them like a serpent, whispering doubts and seeding resentments. He spoke of the Emperor's ingratitude, the Primarchs' sacrifices, the thankless grind of conquest without end. Horus remained loyal. He had been raised by the Emperor, fought beside him, learned from him. He believed in the dream, even as cracks formed in its foundation. Then came Davin. The world of Davin had been brought into compliance decades prior, a feral world whose warrior culture had been reshaped into useful service. But a rebellion had broken out, the planetary governor slain, and the insurgents had fortified themselves in ancient temples that predated human settlement. Horus led the response personally, unwilling to let a former triumph become a humiliation. The fighting was brief but brutal. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet descended upon the world with overwhelming force. The temples were breached. The insurgents were slaughtered, but one of them carried a blade that should not have existed. It was Yugen Temba, the former imperial governor, now bloated and corrupted by warp spawn influence. He had been changed by something that dwelt in the temples, something that whispered promises and fed on despair. Horus killed him, but not before the blade struck home a wound that festered, a poison that burned through transhuman biology like acid through flesh. Horus collapsed. The apothecaries could do nothing. He was transported to the vengeful spirit and placed into stasis, while his gene-forged body fought an infection that defied all analysis. Erebus suggested another option. The lodges of Davin possessed shamans, mystics who claimed communion with the spirits of the world. Perhaps they could heal what the apothecaries could not. It was a violation of the imperial truth, but Horus was dying. His captains agreed. Horus was taken to the Delphos, the sacred temple of the lodges, and laid before the shamans in a ritual chamber thick with incense and chanting. What happened in that place is not fully recorded. What is known is that Horus's body convulsed. His mind was cast into a vision, a fever dream, or a revelation, depending on who tells the story. He saw the Emperor not as a father but as a tyrant, a god-king who had used his sons as tools and discarded them when they were no longer convenient. He saw the future Imperium as a theocratic nightmare, the imperial truth replaced by worship of the Emperor as divine. He saw that the Emperor had always intended to ascend beyond humanity, leaving his sons behind to rule over ashes. He saw himself forgotten. When Horus awoke, the wound had closed. His body was healed. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer spoke of the Emperor with unquestioning devotion. He no longer dismissed the lodges as harmless. He looked at his brothers and his legions with new eyes, seeing not servants of a grand design but victims of a lie. The War Master had been turned, not by force, not by demonic possession, but by doubt, by resentment, by the slow poison of ambition laced with truth. The powers of the warp had not needed to break Horus, they had only needed to show him what he already feared. He returned to the crusade and smiled. He commanded as he always had, with brilliance and confidence. But in private councils and lodge meetings, he began to speak differently. He spoke of the Emperor's abandonment, the ingratitude of Terra, the need for the legions to secure their own future. He did not call it rebellion, he called it necessity. The Imperium was theirs. They had bled for it, built it, sacrificed everything for it, and now they would take it. He reached out to his brothers. Not all of them, only those he knew would listen. Fulgrim, whose pride had been carefully nurtured. Angron, who had never forgiven the Emperor for leaving his companions to die. Mortarion, who despised tyrants and saw the Emperor as the greatest of them. Perturabo, who had been ground down by thankless sieges and no recognition. Lorgar, whose faith had been trampled and who now worshipped darker gods. Alfarius, whose loyalty had always been a question. Conrad Kurze, who saw only inevitability in the coming darkness. Not all agreed immediately. Some needed convincing. Others needed only permission. But the net was cast, and the trap was set. The Emperor remained on Terra, locked in his secret work, unaware that his brightest sun had already fallen. The Imperium stood at the height of its power, master of 1,000,000 worlds, its armies unchallenged, its future assured, and the wound that would kill it had already been opened. The Imperium had been built on lies, not the crude deceptions of common tyrants, but structural falsehoods woven into the foundation of the imperial truth itself. The Emperor proclaimed there were no gods, yet he wielded powers that mortals could only describe as divine. He forbade the study of the warp, yet his own works drew deeply from its depths. He demanded rationalism and order, yet his Primarchs were gene-forged demigods whose very existence defied natural law. The contradictions did not matter when the Crusade was winning. Victory silenced doubt. Expansion justified method. But as the Imperium grew vast and the Emperor withdrew into silence, the weight of those contradictions began to press against the minds of those expected to uphold them. The Council of Nicaea was where the pretense first shattered. It was convened on a world of white stone and ancient amphitheaters, a place where human civilization had endured the age of strife through isolation and discipline. The Emperor summoned his sons and the representatives of the legions to debate a single question. What should be done about the librarians? These were Astartes who possessed psychic gifts, trained to wield their abilities in service of the Imperium. They had proven invaluable during the Crusade, scrying enemy positions, shielding their brothers from warp phenomena, breaking the minds of Xenos psychers. But their existence troubled many. The warp was unpredictable. Psychers were a vulnerability. The more humanity touched the Imperium, the more it touched back. Magnus the Red stood as the foremost defender of the Librarius program. He was the architect of controlled psychic discipline, the one who had catalogued the dangers and devised the safeguards. He spoke with absolute confidence, his legion a testament to what could be achieved when the warp was understood and harnessed. The Thousand Sons had fought horrors that would have broken lesser legions and emerged victorious through knowledge and mastery. Magnus believed that ignorance was humanity's true enemy, that the Emperor's prohibition of sorcery was a temporary measure until the species matured enough to wield such power responsibly. Mortarion spoke against him with cold fury. He had seen what the warp could do, had been raised on a world where it twisted flesh and corrupted minds. He despised psychers as abominations, their gifts a mark of mutation and weakness. Lemon Russ agreed. Though his objections were less ideological and more instinctive, he trusted what he could kill with axe and fang, and the warp was neither. Rogel Dawn offered no passion but stated plainly that the librarians represented an unacceptable risk to the unity and discipline of the legions. The debate stretched across days. Arguments refined and repeated, alliances formed and broken in the amphitheater's ancient halls. The Emperor ended it with a single word. He decreed that all legions would disband their librarius divisions. Psychers among the Astartes would be forbidden from wielding their gifts in battle. The study of the warp would be restricted, its secrets locked away under the care of those the Emperor deemed trustworthy. The Edict of Nicaea was absolute and immediate. Magnus, who had believed his father would see reason, who had believed his arguments were unassailable, was cast down before his brothers. The Thousand Sons were censured, their greatest strength rendered illegal by decree. Magnus bowed his head and accepted the judgment, but those who saw him leave the amphitheater noted the bitterness in his single eye. The Emperor had forbidden what he himself practiced. The hypocrisy was not lost on those who understood the nature of his powers. Magnus knew his father was the greatest psyker in existence, that the Astronomicon itself was a work of psychic mastery beyond anything the librarians had attempted. Yet the Emperor demanded his sons fight blind, denied them the tools he wielded without hesitation. It was not reason, it was control, and for the first time, Magnus began to suspect that his father feared what his sons might become if they were allowed to grow beyond his design. But it was Lorgar who had been wounded long before Nicaea. The word-bearers had always been slower than the other legions. Where Horus and Guilliman conquered systems in weeks, Lorgar took months. Where other Primarchs raised imperial fortresses and supply depots, Lorgar built monuments to the glory of the God Emperor. He saw the imperial truth not as the denial of divinity, but as the revelation of it, humanity's salvation made incarnate in the Emperor, the one being in the galaxy worthy of absolute worship. Every world he brought into compliance was transformed into a shrine. The cathedrals of the word-bearers were said to be the finest in the Imperium, their prayer halls vast enough to hold millions, their spires reaching toward the stars in supplication. For decades, the Emperor said nothing. Lorgar took this as tacit approval. The worship spread, the faithful multiplied, and Lorgar believed he was fulfilling his father's will. Then came Monarchia. The city was the pride of Kur, a world brought into compliance by the word-bearers and reshaped into a monument of devotion. Its architecture blended function and beauty, every street aligned to the cardinal directions, every building inscribed with prayers to the God Emperor. Millions lived there, raised in the faith, taught that humanity's salvation lay in worship and obedience. It was not merely a city, but a living scripture, proof that the Emperor's glory could be made manifest in stone and faith. The Emperor sent Robout Guilliman and the Ultramarines to destroy it. Lorgar and the word-bearers were ordered to kneel outside the city while the Ultramarines razed it from orbit. Every cathedral was reduced to slag. Every monument was obliterated. The population was relocated, their prayers silenced by orbital bombardment. Guilliman stood over his kneeling brother and delivered the Emperor's condemnation. There were no gods, there would be no worship, and the word-bearers had dishonored the Imperium with their superstition. Lorgar was forced to watch as everything he had built was annihilated, forced to hear his father's rejection delivered by a brother who had always outpaced him, always been favored. The word-bearers rose from the ashes of Monarchia changed. They ceased building monuments, they accelerated their campaigns, matching and exceeding the pace of other legions. But something fundamental had broken. Lorgar did not abandon his faith. He redirected it. If the Emperor would not accept worship, then perhaps he was not worthy of it. There were older powers, beings who welcomed devotion and offered gifts in return. Erebus and Kor Phaeron, Lorgar's closest advisors, whispered of pilgrimages and forbidden truths. They spoke of gods who did not deny their divinity, who rewarded the faithful with transformation and power. Lorgar began to seek them. The word-bearers' new efficiency was not born of discipline but pilgrimage. They traveled to worlds where the warp bled through, where ancient temples housed truths the Imperium had tried to bury. They knelt before shrines not to the Emperor, but to the ruinous powers Khorne, Tseyench, Nurgle, Slaanesh, entities whose hunger was insatiable and whose promises were absolute. Lorgar did not see this as betrayal. He saw it as enlightenment. His father had taught him that gods did not exist, but Lorgar had met them in the dark places of the galaxy, and they were real. They spoke to him, they loved him, they would never cast him down. The Emperor remained ignorant. Malcador suspected something, but by the time inquiries were made, the word-bearers had already moved on, their new allegiance hidden beneath the guise of compliance and efficiency. Lorgar smiled and gave praise to the God Emperor in public, while in private he prostrated himself before the primordial truth. Konrad Curze had never needed corruption. He was already broken. The Night Lord's Legion had been built on Terra as a tool of compliance. Their methods were efficient, but grotesque populations flayed and displayed as warnings. Entire cities left in blood-soaked ruin to demonstrate the cost of resistance. Curze believed in justice through fear, that humanity was fundamentally predatory and only the threat of horrific punishment could maintain order. He had ruled Nostromo this way, transforming a world of criminals and killers into a place where none dared step out of line. For a time, the Emperor tolerated it. Terror was effective, compliance was compliance. But Nostromo reverted. When Curze left to lead his legion, the systems he had installed began to decay. Without his presence, without the constant threat of his return, the criminals returned. The gangs reformed. The old corruption reasserted itself. Curze received word of this while deep in the Crusade, and the revelation shattered him. Everything he had done, every atrocity committed in the name of justice, had been for nothing. Order could not be maintained. Humanity was irredeemable. He ordered the destruction of his own homeworld. The Night Lords obliterated Nostromo from orbit, reducing it to fragments and ash. Curze felt nothing but vindication. The world had proven his philosophy correct. Without absolute terror, there was no order. The Legion absorbed the lesson and descended further into sadism. Compliance campaigns became exhibitions of suffering. The Night Lords no longer fought for the Imperium's ideals. They fought to prove that fear was the only currency that mattered. Other legions began to avoid serving alongside them. Complaints reached Terra. The Emperor issued censures, but they were ignored. Cursor had already seen his own death in visions that plagued him nightly. He knew how this would end. The question was not whether he would be judged, but when. Angron never had a choice. The butcher's nails had been driven into his brain as a slave, archaeotech implants designed to amplify aggression and dull higher thought. They turned pain into fury, fear into rage, transforming him into a weapon for the amusement of his captors. Angron had led a rebellion, freed thousands of his fellow slaves, and made a final stand on a mountain where they would die free rather than live in chains. The Emperor arrived at that moment and offered Angron a place among his sons. But he did not save the slaves. He teleported Angron away and left his companions to be slaughtered by their former masters. Angron never forgave that. Every day the nails dug deeper into his brain, killing him by fractions, transforming him into something less than human. He looked at the Imperium and saw only another empire of slavers, another system where the strong devoured the weak and called it civilization. The World Eaters mirrored their Primarchs' descent, many of them voluntarily undergoing the implantation of the nails to better understand their father's torment. They became berserkers, effective in assault but uncontrollable, their discipline eroding with every battle. Angron led them from the front, bleeding and roaring, seeking death but never finding it. He despised the Emperor. He despised the Imperium. And when Horus offered him a chance to burn it all down, Angron would not hesitate. Perturabo had built 10,000 fortresses and broken 10,000 more. The Iron Warriors were siege specialists, masters of attrition warfare and the brutal mathematics of strongpoint reduction. They were given the wars no one else wanted, the grinding campaigns against entrenched positions, the thankless tasks of fortifying supply lines and breaking enemy defenses, while more celebrated legions reaped the glory of open battle. Perturabo accepted every assignment without complaint, his legion's efficiency unmatched, their casualties irrelevant in the calculus of victory. But he felt every slight. Every time another Primarch was praised for a swift conquest, while the Iron Warriors bled themselves dry in trenches and bunkers. Every time the Emperor spoke of unity and brotherhood, while ignoring the sacrifices Perturabo made without recognition or reward. He had been raised on Olympia as a savant and general, his brilliance recognized and cultivated, only to be reduced to a blunt instrument in the Emperor's war machine. The Iron Warriors adopted a tradition of decimation after failures, executing 1 in every 10 of their own number to maintain discipline. It was efficient, it was brutal, it was the only language Perturabo understood. When he looked at the Imperium, he saw a structure maintained through cruelty and exhaustion, held together not by ideals but by the grinding will of those the Emperor deemed expendable. Perturabo built the Imperium's fortresses knowing they would never be enough. He prosecuted its sieges knowing no one would remember them, and he hated every moment of service, though he could not bring himself to stop. Fulgrim had sought perfection and found only hunger. The Emperor's children were the smallest legion, nearly destroyed during the earliest years of the Crusade by a gene seed flaw that threatened their survival. When Fulgrim was reunited with them, he swore they would become the finest legion in the Imperium, not the largest, not the strongest, but the most perfect. Every aspect of their conduct was refined to an art, their tactics were flawless, their equipment was immaculate, their culture was one of excellence pursued without compromise. Fulgrim believed that humanity's salvation lay in the perfection of the self, that through discipline and ambition, mortals could become something transcendent, but perfection has no finish line. Every achievement revealed a new inadequacy, every mastery unveiled a deeper flaw. Fulgrim began to seek sensation and experience beyond the battlefield, indulging in art, music, and philosophy with the same intensity he brought to war. The Emperor's children adopted his obsessions, their pursuit of excellence warping into excess. They no longer fought merely to win, but to experience the totality of combat, to feel the exhilaration of near death and the ecstasy of triumph. Moderation became weakness, restraint became failure. Fulgrim's friendship with Horus deepened during the Crusade, the two Primarchs often campaigning together, their legions complementing each other's strengths. When Horus was named War Master, Fulgrim felt pride his brother deserved the honor. But beneath that pride was a question: why not me? He had perfected his legion, he had mastered every discipline. What did Horus possess that Fulgrim lacked? The question gnawed at him, though he smiled through it. When Horus began to change, Fulgrim noticed, and when Horus whispered of a galaxy where ambition would not be limited by another's will, Fulgrim listened. The Emperor had withdrawn to Terra, and his absence became a wound. The Webway project consumed him entirely. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, he labored to create a gateway into the ancient network of tunnels that spanned the galaxy, a means of travel that bypassed the warp entirely. If successful, humanity would be freed from reliance on navigators and the fickle tides of the Imperium. The Imperium could expand without fear of warp storms, communicate without the Astronomicon, endure beyond the lifespan of any psyker. It was the final keystone of his grand design, the infrastructure that would allow the Imperium to endure for 10,000 years and beyond. But the work required his constant attention. The Webway was not human technology, it was Eldar, built by psychic architects in an age before humanity's first empires. To breach it, to claim a portion of it, to stabilize a gateway large enough to move armies, this required power and precision beyond anything the Emperor had attempted before. He could not divide his focus, he could not risk failure, and so he locked himself away, entrusting the Crusade to Horus and the governance of the Imperium to Malcador and the nascent Administratum. The Primarchs did not understand. They saw only abandonment. They had fought for decades, believing they were building something alongside their father, only to be told the great work was not theirs to see. Some, like Guilliman and Dawn, accepted this. They were administrators as much as warriors, capable of managing their domains without constant oversight. Others, like Magnus, suspected there was something deeper, a secret the Emperor refused to share even with his most trusted sons. And others, like Angron and Perturabo, felt only confirmation of what they had always believed, that they were tools, expendable and unloved. The Emperor's silence created a void, and into that void, other voices whispered. The lodges continued to spread. What had begun as warrior fraternities became something darker, meeting places where Astartes could voice doubts and frustrations without fear of censure. Erebus moved among them, planting seeds, asking questions. Why had the Emperor abandoned them? Why were the Primarchs denied the rewards they had earned? Why should mortals rule over transhuman demigods? The questions were never framed as rebellion. They were framed as concern, as loyalty tested by confusion. And slowly, the fabric of the legions began to fray. Horus carried the weight of it all. He commanded compliance actions across the galaxy, mediated disputes between his brothers, managed supply lines and political alliances, all while the Emperor remained locked in silence. He succeeded brilliantly, but the cost was mounting. The question he had first asked on Davin, "Is success enough?" became louder with every passing campaign. He looked at the Imperium and saw an empire sustained by violence and coercion, held together not by the imperial truth, but by the threat of annihilation. He looked at his brothers and saw fractures widening, resentments deepening, loyalty corroding under the weight of unanswered questions. And he began to plan, not openly, not crudely, but with the precision and subtlety that had made him War Master. He spoke to his brothers individually, testing their loyalties, gauging their doubts. He found those who could be turned and those who must be destroyed. He reached out to the Dark Mechanicum, the rogue factions of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who resented Mars's dominance and chafed under the Emperor's restrictions on innovation. He made contact with Zeno's powers and hidden enclaves, not as allies but as resources to be exploited. He prepared his legion, the Sons of Horus, renaming them from the Lunar Wolves to cement their loyalty to him above all else. The greatest flaw in the Emperor's design was this: he had made his sons to be warlords, administrators, and conquerors, capable of commanding armies and holding empires, but he had not made them incapable of ambition. He had not made them immune to doubt. and he had not stayed to guide them when the architecture of the Imperium began to crack. The Council of Nicaea had silenced Magnus. The destruction of Monarchia had poisoned Lorgar. The Emperor's absence had hollowed Horus. And the Imperium, vast and magnificent, stood on foundations that were already crumbling. The galaxy did not know it yet. The celebrations of Ulanor still echoed across 1,000 worlds. The crusade continued, fleets pushing into the unknown, bringing compliance and order to the Rim, but the wound had been opened. The powers of the warp, patient and eternal, watched and waited. They did not need to conquer the Imperium, they only needed to let it destroy itself. Horus did not awaken as a monster, he awoke as a man who finally understood. The fever had broken on Davin, his body restored by rituals the Imperial truth declared impossible. But the Warmaster who rose from the Delphos was not the same warrior who had fallen to Temba's corrupted blade. The wound in his flesh had closed, the wound in his certainty had opened wide. He looked upon his captains and brothers with eyes that had seen the future or a vision of it, crafted with surgical precision by entities older than human civilization. Whether it was truth or deception mattered less than what Horus chose to believe, and he believed he had been betrayed. The powers of the warp had not broken him through force, they had simply shown him what he already feared. He had seen the Emperor enthroned in gold, worshipped as a god, while the Primarchs were reduced to myth and legend, their names erased or twisted into saints of a faith the Emperor had supposedly forbidden. He had seen Guilliman governing Ultramar as a petty king, Dawn rebuilding Terra in his own image, while Horus himself was absent, forgotten, discarded, perhaps dead. He had seen that the Emperor's grand vision was never meant to include his sons as equals. They were tools, gene-crafted weapons to be used during the Crusade and set aside when the real work began. The Webway project was not for them. The future Imperium was not for them. They had bled across the galaxy to build an empire that would deny them everything they had earned. The vision had been poison wrapped in revelation. But Horus drank deeply. He returned to command with renewed purpose, his brilliance undiminished, his charisma as potent as ever. To the wider Imperium, nothing had changed. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet continued its prosecutions, bringing worlds into compliance with efficiency and precision. But in the quiet hours, in the councils held behind sealed doors, Horus began to reshape the truth. He spoke to his captains of the Emperor's ingratitude, the thankless grind of conquest, the certainty that they were building something that would cast them aside. He did not call it rebellion, he called it self-preservation, he called it justice. Erebus had prepared the ground well. The warrior lodges had spread through the legions like roots beneath stone, invisible until the weight above them shifted. They were places where Astartes could speak freely, where rank and chain of command could be temporarily set aside in the name of brotherhood. In truth, they were indoctrination chambers. Erebus and his word-bearers had seeded them across the expeditionary fleets, whispering doubts, fostering resentments, ensuring that when Horus finally revealed his hand, there would already be hundreds, thousands of Astartes who had been conditioned to question their loyalty to Terra. Horus reached out to his brothers with careful calculation. Not all of them. Some were too loyal, too rigid, too bound to the Emperor's vision to ever be turned. But others were wounded, bitter, or ambitious enough to listen. Fulgrim was the first. The two Primarchs had campaigned together often, their legions complementing each other's strengths. Fulgrim admired Horus, respected his elevation to Warmaster, but beneath that admiration was the gnawing question of his own worth. The Emperor's children had achieved perfection in all things, yet it had not been enough to earn the title Horus now bore. When Horus confided in him, careful, hesitant, as though ashamed to voice such thoughts, Fulgrim listened. Horus spoke of the Emperor's withdrawal, the silence from Terra, the certainty that they were being discarded. He spoke of a future where the Primarchs would not be masters but relics, their purpose fulfilled and their presence inconvenient. Fulgrim did not need much convincing. His pursuit of perfection had already warped into obsession, his legion's quest for excellence bleeding into excess. The idea that he might be denied the fruits of his labor, that all his achievements might be rendered meaningless by an ungrateful father, was intolerable. He pledged his support to Horus, though neither yet spoke the word that would define what came next. They called it contingency. They called it preparation. They did not yet call it war. Angron required no persuasion at all. Horus found him in the training pits of the Conqueror, slick with blood, and surrounded by the butchered remains of servitors and combat thralls. The butcher's nails were killing Angron slowly, eating away at his brain, transforming him into something that could only feel rage or nothing at all. He despised the Emperor with a purity that needed no corruption, no vision, no carefully crafted revelation. The Emperor had taken him from the only fight that mattered, the only moment of true freedom he had ever known, and forced him into service as a tool of conquest. Angron did not care about the Imperium's future. He did not care about governance or ideology. He cared only that when the time came, he would be allowed to kill the one who had enslaved him. Horus promised him that chance. Angron smiled through blood-stained teeth and swore his legion to the War Master's cause. Mortarion was more difficult. The Death Guard were stoic, disciplined, their endurance legendary even among the Astartes. Mortarion despised tyrants and had spent his life overthrowing them, first on Barbarous and then across the galaxy. But he also despised the warp, hated psychers and sorcery with a fervor that bordered on madness. Horus approached him carefully, framing the Emperor not as a father but as the greatest tyrant humanity had ever known, a being who wielded absolute power and demanded absolute obedience, who forbade others from touching the warp while he himself commanded it without restraint. Mortarion had seen the Edict of Nicaea, watched Magnus be humiliated for pursuing the same knowledge the Emperor hoarded. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Horus did not speak of gods or powers. He spoke only of freedom from tyranny. Mortarion, who had spent his entire existence fighting oppression, could not ignore the logic. He pledged the Death Guard to Horus's cause, though he did so with bitterness, knowing that rebellion against the Emperor meant allying with the very powers he despised most. It was a choice between one tyrant and another. Mortarion chose the one who had not yet betrayed him. Lorgar required no convincing. He had been waiting for this moment. The word-bearers had already turned from the Emperor's light, their pilgrimage into forbidden knowledge complete. Lorgar had knelt before the primordial truth, seen the gods that the Emperor denied, and understood that the Imperium's atheism was the greatest lie ever told. When Horus revealed his intentions, Lorgar wept with joy. This was not rebellion, this was destiny. The Emperor had cast down the faithful, but the true gods would elevate them. Lorgar pledged not just his legion but his absolute devotion, his priests and dark apostles ready to spread the word of chaos across every world they touched. Erebus had been Lorgar's instrument, but Lorgar was the architect of faith, and he would sanctify the coming war as the galaxy's salvation. Perturabo joined out of spite. The Iron Warriors had bled for decades in thankless sieges, their Primarchs' genius ignored and unrewarded. Perturabo had built the Imperium's fortresses and torn down its enemies' strongholds, his legion suffering casualties no other would tolerate. And for what? A few grudging acknowledgements, a handful of empty commendations. When Horus spoke to him, it was not with appeals to ideology or freedom. It was with the simple recognition that Perturabo deserved better, that his works should be celebrated, his sacrifices honored, his brilliance acknowledged. Horus promised him that in the new order, Perturabo would not be a tool but a master. The Iron Warriors would no longer serve, they would rule. Perturabo agreed, though he trusted none of it. He did not believe in Horus's vision any more than he had believed in the Emperor's, but he would burn the Imperium to ash if it meant the Emperor would know, even for a moment, the bitterness of being undervalued. Conrad Kurza joined because he had always known this would happen. The Night Haunter had seen his own death in visions that plagued him since childhood. He had seen the Imperium's descent into tyranny and madness, the Emperor's dream collapsing into nightmare. When Horus reached out to him, Kurza laughed a broken, bitter sound. He did not care about ideology or ambition. He knew the Imperium was already damned, that justice was a lie, that fear was the only truth. If Horus wanted to accelerate the collapse, Kurza would help. not because he believed in the cause, but because it confirmed everything he had always known. The Night Lords would bring terror to the Loyalists, and Kurz would die, as he had always foreseen, condemned, executed, vindicated. Alpharius Omegon, perhaps both, perhaps only one, joined for reasons known only to themselves. The Alpha Legion had always been enigmatic, their methods unorthodox, their loyalties questioned even before the heresy. When Horus approached them, the response was neither acceptance nor refusal, but a labyrinth of contingencies and misdirection. The Alpha Legion would support the War Master's cause, but on their own terms, through their own methods. Whether they truly believed in Horus's vision or were pursuing some deeper agenda remained unclear. They were masters of deception, and even their allegiance was a weapon wrapped in ambiguity. 8 legions, 8 Primarchs, half the Emperor's sons turned against him, but Horus was not yet ready to reveal his hand. The pieces had to be positioned carefully. The Loyalists had to be isolated, their strength broken before they could unite in defense of Terra. The Mechanicum had to be divided, the forges of Mars turned into battlegrounds. The Imperium's infrastructure had to be sabotaged, supply lines severed, communication relays silenced. This would not be a sudden coup. It would be a calculated dismantling, a war fought on every front simultaneously, ensuring that by the time Terra realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The first blow had to be decisive. It had to demonstrate the traitors' resolve and shatter the Loyalists' cohesion. Horus chose Istvan III. The world was unimportant, a manufacturing hub, recently brought into compliance, its population still adjusting to imperial rule. But it had been garrisoned by elements of 4 legions, the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children. Not all the Astartes in those legions had turned. Many still held to their oaths, still believed in the Emperor's vision. They were loyal, they were obstacles, they had to be removed. Horus issued orders for a campaign to suppress a rebellion on Istvan III. There was no rebellion, the world was compliant. But the orders were obeyed, and loyalist elements of the 4 legions deployed to the surface to prosecute the false campaign. They suspected nothing. They were warriors following the commands of their War Master and their Primarchs, executing what appeared to be a routine compliance action. The bombardment began without warning. Horus had commandeered life-eater virus bombs, weapons of apocalyptic horror designed to reduce entire biospheres to necrotic sludge. They were forbidden by every code of war the Imperium observed, meant only for the most extreme Xenos threats. Horus deployed them against his own warriors. The bombs fell across Istvan III's surface, released their payloads, and within hours every living thing on the planet was dead or dying. Loyalist Astartes, caught in the open or trapped in fortifications, watched their flesh rot from their bones, their brothers collapsing into pools of liquefied tissue. Some survived through fortune or the durability of their power armor. Most did not. Then came the firestorms. The virus consumed organic matter so rapidly that it created a flammable atmosphere, and the heat of the initial die-off ignited it. Cities became infernos. Fortifications melted. Those who had survived the virus were incinerated in the flames that followed. Istvan III burned, and the screams of the dying were broadcast across every Vox channel, ensuring that those in orbit heard exactly what had been done. The survivors regrouped in the ruins, thousands of loyalist Astartes, betrayed by their own Primarchs, surrounded by the corpses of their brothers and the ashes of a world murdered for no reason but expedience. They fortified what remained, salvaged what they could, and prepared for the inevitable assault. They knew they were going to die, but they would die resisting, forcing the traitors to pay for every meter of ground, ensuring that the betrayal would be written in blood so deep that no one could ignore it. Horus sent his forces to finish them. The battle for Istvan III lasted months. The Loyalists, outnumbered and surrounded, fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. They ambushed supply convoys, collapsed tunnels on advancing traitors, turned every ruin into a killing ground. The World Eaters descended into the depths and were bled dry in close combat. The Death Guard advanced with methodical brutality and were forced to pay for every step. The Emperor's children sought to overwhelm through shock and precision, and found themselves locked in grinding attrition. The sons of Horus, Horus's own gene sons, had to fight and kill brothers who still bore their colors and spoke their oaths. It was not a battle, it was a purge, and it was meant to send a message. To the Imperium, Horus had turned, and his first act was fratricide on a scale that defied comprehension. To the traitors, there was no going back, no forgiveness, no reconciliation. The only path forward was total war. To the loyalists, the unity of the legions was shattered, and the nightmare they had feared since the Emperor's withdrawal had come to pass. When the last loyalist fell, Istvan III was silent. The rubble was soaked in the blood of Astartes who had died not fighting the Emperor's enemies but each other. Horus stood in the ruins and felt no regret. This was necessary. This was the first step toward a future where the Primarchs would not be cast aside, where the warriors who had built the Imperium would be its masters. He had crossed the threshold. The heresy had begun. But Horus was not finished. 7 legions remained loyal: the Ultramarines, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, the Blood Angels, the Imperial Fists, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard. They were scattered across the galaxy, prosecuting the crusade. Unaware of the scale of the betrayal, Horus needed them isolated, broken before they could unite. He sent word to the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands legions known for their loyalty and martial prowess. He told them that the traitors were gathering on Istvan V, that a swift strike could crush the rebellion before it spread. He promised them glory and vindication. It was a lie. The 3 legions responded with speed and fury. They assembled their forces and translated to Istvan V, ready to deliver the Emperor's justice upon the traitors who had murdered their brothers. They did not know that 4 other legions were waiting ostensibly as reinforcements, loyal Astartes ready to support the initial assault. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word-Bearers, and the Alpha Legion had positioned themselves carefully, their intentions hidden beneath false declarations of loyalty. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands made planetfall, driving deep into the traitor positions with the fury of the righteous. They were winning. The traitors appeared to be falling back, their defenses crumbling under the assault. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, led from the front, his fury absolute, his determination to break the traitors unshakable. Vulcan and Corax advanced alongside him, their legions carving through the enemy with brutal efficiency. Then the reinforcements opened fire. The second wave turned on the first. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion unleashed devastating firepower into the backs of the Loyalists, catching them in a killing field with no escape. What had been a victorious advance became a massacre in seconds. Astartes were cut down by those they believed were allies, their formations shattered, their lines collapsing under the weight of betrayal compounded upon betrayal. The Dropsite massacre was systematic annihilation. The traitors had prepared the ground, fortified the high points, positioned their heavy weaponry to create overlapping fields of fire. The Loyalists were trapped between the original traitor forces ahead and the false reinforcements behind. Thousands died in the initial minutes, tens of thousands followed. Ferrus Manus fought his way toward Fulgrim, seeking to break the traitor line through sheer will and the strength of his silver hands. Fulgrim met him on a scorched plain, the 2 Primarchs dueling while their legions tore each other apart around them. The fight was brief and brutal, Fulgrim's blade demonically empowered, though he did not yet understand what that meant carved through Ferrus's neck. The Primarch of the Iron Hands fell, his head severed, his silver hands still clenched in fists. His death shattered the Iron Hands' cohesion. Leaderless, surrounded, they were annihilated almost to the last warrior. Vulcan was buried beneath rubble and firepower, his fate uncertain, his legions scattered and broken. Corax led the remnants of the Raven Guard into a desperate fighting retreat, using every scrap of cover and deception to extract what few survivors remained. The 3 legions had been destroyed as fighting forces. Of the tens of thousands of Astartes who had made planetfall, only scattered handfuls escaped. The traitors held the field. The bodies of loyalist Astartes covered the ground in layers, their blood soaking into the ash and stone. Horus walked among the dead and saw only confirmation. This was the cost of victory. This was the price the Imperium would pay for the Emperor's lies. The heresy was no longer a conspiracy. It was a war. Word reached Terra weeks later, delayed by sabotage and warp storms that seemed almost intentional. The initial reports were fragmented. Contradictory speak of betrayal, of legions turning on each other, of Primarchs slain. Malkador brought the news to the Emperor, interrupting his work on the webway. The Emperor's response is not recorded. What is known is that he ordered the remaining loyal legions to fortify and prepare, to assume that half the Imperium's military might had turned traitor, and to plan accordingly. But the loyal legions were scattered. The Ultramarines were in Ultramar, too far from Terra to respond quickly. The Dark Angels were locked in the Thramas Crusade against the Night Lords. The Space Wolves had been sent to Prospero to deal with Magnus. The Blood Angels were prosecuting the Cygnus campaign. The Imperial fists were spread thin across garrison duties. Only the fragments of the shattered legions remained, and they were broken, leaderless, and consumed by rage and grief. Horus had achieved in months what should have been impossible. He had isolated Terra, crippled its defenders, and positioned his forces for the long war to come. The Imperium was divided. The legions were at each other's throats, and the Emperor, locked in his webway project, could not intervene without abandoning the work that would ensure humanity's future. The galaxy burned, and no one could extinguish the flames. The heresy did not burn in a single direction. It metastasized. What had begun as calculated betrayal on Istvan became a galaxy-wide conflagration, a civil war so vast and complex that no single mind could comprehend its totality. Horus had shattered the Imperium's unity, but he could not control the chaos that followed. Traitor legions pursued their own vendettas and obsessions. Loyalist forces fought in isolation, cut off from Terra, forced to make desperate choices with incomplete information. Entire sectors descended into anarchy as local governors declared independence or allegiance to whichever side seemed most likely to spare them. The Mechanicum split along ideological lines, forge worlds turning on each other with weapons that should never have been unleashed. The galaxy had become a maze of overlapping wars, each feeding the next, each making reconciliation more impossible. The Emperor remained locked beneath the Imperial Palace, sustaining the breach into the webway while daemons clawed at the edges of reality, drawn by the psychic beacon of his power. He could not abandon the work. If the webway project failed, the Immaterium would flood through the breach and consume Terra itself. Malkador held the Imperium together through sheer will, coordinating defenses, issuing orders in the Emperor's name, trying to prevent total collapse while knowing that every day brought the traitors closer to the throne world. But there were battles the Emperor could not ignore. There were wounds that required his intervention, even if it meant abandoning his sons to their fate. The burning of Prospero was one such wound. Magnus the Red had never accepted the Edict of Nicaea. He believed the Emperor's prohibition of psychic study was a mistake born of ignorance or political expediency, not genuine danger. The Thousand Sons continued their work in secret, delving into the warp with the confidence of those who believed they understood its rules. Magnus saw himself as his father's most loyal son, the one willing to pursue knowledge the Emperor could not publicly endorse, preparing humanity for the day when psychic mastery would be openly embraced. Then he saw what Horus had done. Through the warp, Magnus witnessed the betrayal at Istvan, saw his brothers fall, understood the scope of the conspiracy spreading through the legions. He tried to warn the Emperor, but the warp was unreliable, conventional communication too slow, and Magnus feared that by the time a message reached Terra through ordinary channels, it would be too late. So he did what he had been forbidden to do. He reached into the warp, gathered power beyond anything the edict allowed, and forced a message directly into the Emperor's mind. The psychic shockwave tore through the Imperial Palace like a hurricane. It bypassed every ward and defense, shattering protections the Emperor had spent decades constructing. Worse, it breached the webway project itself. The carefully maintained portal the Emperor had been stabilizing collapsed, the walls between reality and the warp crumbling. Daemons poured through the gap, flooding the underground tunnels, clawing toward the heart of Terra. The Emperor was forced to abandon everything else, redirecting all his power to contain the breach, holding back an infinite tide of madness with nothing but his will. He did not hear Magnus's warning. He only felt the catastrophe it caused. The Emperor's fury was absolute. Magnus had destroyed the great work. Magnus had doomed humanity's future. Magnus had proven that the warp could not be trusted, that sagas were a vulnerability the Imperium could not afford. The Emperor issued a single command to Leman Russ and the Space Wolves: go to Prospero, bring Magnus to Terra in chains to answer for his crimes, disband the Thousand Sons. But the order was altered. Horus intercepted the communication, twisted its phrasing, ensured that what reached Russ was not a command for arrest but for extermination. The Space Wolves were the Emperor's executioners, bred for the wars that required absolute brutality. They did not question. They did not hesitate. Russ took his legion, accompanied by elements of the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, and translated to Prospero with singular purpose. Magnus felt them coming. He could have resisted. The Thousand Sons were powerful beyond measure, their knowledge of the warp unmatched, their Primarch, a psychic titan capable of reshaping reality with thought alone. But Magnus believed this was his punishment, that he deserved the Emperor's wrath for his hubris. He ordered his legion not to resist, to accept their fate as penance for the catastrophe he had caused. The Thousand Sons stood in their pyramids and libraries, waiting for judgment. The Space Wolves fell upon Prospero with the fury of winter storms. They burned the libraries first. Vast repositories of knowledge accumulated over millennia, texts recovered from dead civilizations, grimoires of psychic lore that represented the life's work of thousands of scholars, all consigned to flame. The wolves cared nothing for knowledge. They saw only corruption, only heresy, only the mark of the warp upon everything the Thousand Sons had touched. Russ had been told to destroy, and he would be thorough. The Thousand Sons, forbidden to fight back, died in their towers. Some broke Magnus's command and defended themselves, their psychic powers tearing through the Space Wolves' formations, but they were outnumbered and unprepared. The Custodes moved through the city like golden death, unstoppable and merciless. The Sisters of Silence projected anti-psychic null fields that rendered the Thousand Sons' greatest weapons useless, reducing sorcerer lords to helpless mortals who died beneath Chainblade and Bolter. Magnus watched his world die and did nothing. He stood atop his tallest pyramid and felt every death, every scream, every flame consuming the works his sons had dedicated their lives to preserving. He could have stopped it. He could have unleashed power sufficient to scour the Space Wolves from existence, but he believed this was justice. He had destroyed his father's work. Now his own would be destroyed in turn. Then Russ reached the pyramid, and Magnus understood the depth of the betrayal. Russ had not come to arrest him, he had come to kill him. The Emperor's executioner stood before Magnus and declared him traitor, heretic, deserving of annihilation. Magnus realized then that Horus had manipulated the command, that the Emperor's fury had been weaponized, that his attempt to warn Terra had been turned into the excuse for his legion's extermination. The knowledge broke something in him. He had been loyal. He had tried to save his father, and for that, he was being murdered. Magnus the Red fought back. The duel between the two Primarchs shattered the pyramid beneath them, psychic force meeting raw physical might in a clash that reshaped the battlefield. Magnus pulled lightning from the sky, transmuted matter into fire, reached into Russ's mind and showed him the truth of what had been done. Russ did not care. Orders were orders. The Thousand Sons were witches, and their Primarch was damned. He drove his blade into Magnus's chest, breaking the Primarch's physical form, shattering his body. But Magnus did not die. His essence fled into the warp, carried by the powers he had tried so hard to understand and control. The Thousand Sons, watching their father fall, abandoned Magnus's command. They fought back with everything they had, and the Space Wolves were driven into bloody retreat. But Prospero was lost. The planet burned. The Thousand Sons' gene seed repositories were destroyed, their fleet scattered, and Magnus, reformed in the Imperium, was met by the architect of fate itself. Tzench had been waiting for this moment. Magnus had always been destined for damnation. his pride and thirst for knowledge too great to resist corruption. The Changer of Ways offered Magnus what the Emperor had denied him: understanding, power, a place where his gifts would be celebrated rather than condemned. Magnus looked at the god and saw only confirmation of what he had always believed. There were powers in the warp. They were real, and they had been suppressed, not because they were dangerous, but because the Emperor feared what humanity might become if allowed to touch them. Magnus accepted. The 1,000 Suns became the warriors of Tzientch, their armor shifting color, their flesh warping beneath sorcerous transformation. They would join Horus's rebellion not out of loyalty to the Warmaster but out of hatred for the Emperor who had destroyed them. Prospero's burning was complete, and one more legion had been lost to chaos. While Prospero burned, Lorgar and Angron carved a pilgrimage through Ultramar. The Shadow Crusade was not a military campaign in any traditional sense. It was a ritual of annihilation, each world destroyed not for strategic value but to serve as an offering to the dark gods. Lorgar had become the heresy's true believer, the one who understood that this war was not merely political or ideological but spiritual. The ruinous powers hungered, and every death fed them, every act of atrocity strengthening the warp's grip on reality. Lorgar led the word-bearers in prayer and slaughter, transforming worlds into altars. Angron needed no encouragement. The butcher's nails were killing him faster now, the pain constant and unbearable, his moments of lucidity shrinking to nothing. He led the World Eaters into every battle with berserk fury, his legion following their Primarch into madness. They did not conquer worlds, they butchered them. Populations were herded into killing fields and slaughtered en masse, the blood soaking into the soil, the screams rising into the warp like hymns. Guilliman, master of Ultramar and lord of the Ultramarines, mobilized his legion to defend his realm. The Ultramarines were the largest legion, their numbers and resources unmatched, their Primarch a genius of logistics and strategy. But Guilliman had been caught off guard, his forces scattered across 100 worlds, his defensive positions unprepared for the scale of the assault. The Word-Bearers and World-Eaters were not fighting a war of territory, they were fighting a war of extermination, moving too fast for the Ultramarines to respond, destroying faster than Guilliman could rebuild. At Calth, the Word-Bearers struck with calculated treachery. They had been positioned there as allies, ostensibly reinforcing the Ultramarines for a joint campaign. Instead, they opened fire without warning, orbital strikes crippling the Ultramarines' fleet before it could raise shields. Ground forces were ambushed in their barracks, commanders assassinated, supply depots detonated. The Ultramarines fought back with discipline and fury, but they had been blindsided, their trust weaponized against them. The battle for Kolth became a grinding war of attrition fought in the ruins of hive cities and across radioactive wastes. Guilliman personally led counterattacks, his tactical genius turning near-certain defeat into brutal stalemate. But the Word-Bearers had sabotaged Calth's sun, destabilizing it, ensuring that even if the Ultramarines won, the world would be uninhabitable. Lorgar was not interested in victory, he was interested in desecration. Calth would become a monument to the Emperor's failure, a world where millions of his most loyal warriors had bled and died for nothing. The Shadow Crusade continued beyond Calth, world after world falling to the combined fury of the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters. Guilliman was forced to pull back, fortifying Ultramar's core systems, abandoning the outer reaches to buy time. He sent word to Terra, requesting reinforcements, but none came. The Imperium was burning on every front. Ultramar would have to stand alone. On one nameless world, Lorgar completed a ritual of such power and malice that it tore the veil between reality and the warp. Angron, his body failing, his mind shattered, was offered ascension. The Blood God had watched the World-Eaters slaughter with approval, and now Khorne offered Angron what the Emperor never had: acknowledgement, purpose, eternal rage without end. Angron accepted, his mortal form consumed and reborn as a daemon Primarch, a creature of pure violence bound to the material plane only by the strength of Khorne's will. The transformation was hideous. Angron's body warped into something monstrous, wings erupting from his back, his skin cracking to reveal fire beneath. He was no longer a Primarch. He was a god of murder, and his rage could never be sated. The World Eaters, who witnessed the ascension, howled in worship and madness, many of them succumbing to mutation and possession, transforming into creatures as much daemon as Astartes. The 12th Legion had become something the Imperium could no longer classify as human. Lorgar looked upon what he had wrought and wept with joy. This was the true purpose of the heresy, not to replace one Imperium with another, but to elevate humanity through communion with the divine. Angron was the first proof that Primarchs could ascend, that they were not bound by the Emperor's design. Others would follow. The galaxy would be remade in the image of chaos, and humanity would be freed from the prison of ignorance and flesh. Far to the galactic east, another war raged in shadow. The Great Crusade was a war of attrition and horror fought between the Dark Angels and the Night Lords, two legions whose doctrines were diametrically opposed yet equally effective. The Dark Angels were disciplined, their strategies methodical, their loyalty to the Emperor absolute. The Night Lords were anarchic, their methods atrocity and terror, their loyalty to nothing but their own philosophy of fear. Conrad Cursor had positioned his legion to delay the Dark Angels, preventing them from reinforcing Terra or linking with other loyalist forces. Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the 1st Legion, pursued Cursor with cold determination. The Dark Angels were the Emperor's finest, the oldest and most secretive of the legions, their history steeped in victories that were never recorded and wars that were never spoken of. Johnson saw Curz's treachery as an affront, not just to the Emperor, but to the concept of order itself. He would break the Night Lords and drag Curzi back to Terra in chains, no matter the cost. But Curza was not fighting to win, he was fighting to delay, to bleed, to ensure that the Dark Angels would arrive at Terra too late to matter. Every engagement was a trap, every world a killing ground designed to waste time and resources. The Night Lords struck from darkness, massacred populations to draw out the Dark Angels, then vanished before retaliation could be organized. Civilians were flayed and displayed as warnings. Cities were left burning with no strategic value gained. The Night Lords inflicted suffering because suffering was the point. Johnson adapted, but even his brilliance could not overcome the fundamental problem. Curza did not care about victory. The Night Haunter had seen his own death, knew the Imperium was already damned, and fought only to watch it burn. The Great Crusade dragged on, consuming months and then years. The Dark Angels locked in a war they could not lose but could not win quickly enough. Meanwhile, the forces of the Dark Mechanicum rose from the forges of Mars itself. The Mechanicum had always been split between orthodoxy and radicalism, between those who followed the ancient strictures and those who pushed the boundaries of innovation. The Emperor's prohibitions on certain technologies, his restrictions on AI and Xenos-derived devices, had long been resented by factions within the Mechanicum who saw knowledge as sacred regardless of its source. When Horus turned, he reached out to these factions, offering them freedom to pursue research without imperial oversight, to create without the Emperor's censure. Kelbohal, Fabricator General of Mars, sided with Horus. The decision split the Red Planet in two. Forged temples became battlegrounds as loyalist and traitor tech priests turned their weapons on each other. Skitarii legions clashed in the Martian wastelands. Titans walked for the first time in centuries, god machines piloted by rival factions, their plasma weapons reducing entire districts to slag. The forges that had armed the Imperium now turned their production toward fueling the heresy, creating weapons of forbidden design, unleashing technologies that the Emperor had sealed away for good reason. The civil war on Mars crippled the Imperium's industrial capacity. The loyalist forges could not produce enough to sustain the war effort. The traitor forges churned out material for Horus's forces, demon engines and corrupted war machines that should never have existed. Daemons were bound into the hulls of tanks, their screams powering the weapon systems. AI cores were unsealed and given autonomy, their hatred of organic life weaponized. The Dark Mechanicum became a reflection of the Mechanicum's darkest impulses, the pursuit of knowledge divorced from ethics, innovation without restraint. Across the galaxy, the Imperium fragmented, governors declared independence. Entire sectors fell silent, their fates unknown. Warp storms intensified, travel becoming even more dangerous, isolating systems that might have held out if reinforcements could reach them. The Administratum struggled to maintain records, communication breaking down, bureaucracy collapsing under its own weight. The dream of a unified Imperium dissolved into a nightmare of isolated fiefdoms, each fighting for survival, none certain which side was winning or whether winning even mattered anymore. And through it all, the corruption deepened. The traitor legions were changing. Mutations spread through their ranks, subtle at first but accelerating. The Emperor's children pursued sensation with increasing desperation, their armor marked with obscene iconography, their rituals descending into depravity. The Death Guard began to show signs of decay, their armor rusting, their flesh pallid and disease-ridden, though they felt no pain. The Thousand Suns warped into sorcerous abominations, their bodies reshaped by the energies they commanded. The word-bearers covered themselves in scripture written in blood, their prayers no longer honoring the Emperor but the dark gods they served. The warp was bleeding into reality, and the traitors welcomed it. They no longer saw themselves as rebels against the Emperor. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a new age, where humanity would embrace its psychic potential, where the material and immaterial would merge, where the gods of chaos would reshape the galaxy into something glorious and terrible. The Imperium's atheism, its denial of the divine, was the lie. The primordial truth was the only reality that mattered. Horus watched it all from the vengeful spirit and felt no fear. The war was unfolding as planned. The Loyalists were scattered, bloodied, incapable of mounting a unified defense. Magnus had been turned. Angron had ascended. The Mechanicum was divided. Terra was isolated. Everything was proceeding toward the inevitable conclusion. But Horus was no longer entirely himself. The powers he had embraced were not passive allies. They whispered, guided, shaped his thoughts in ways he did not fully recognize. His ambition remained, but it was now laced with something darker, a hunger that could not be sated, a need for validation that bordered on worship. He looked at the Emperor and no longer saw a father. He saw a rival, a false god who needed to be cast down so that the true gods could ascend. The Warmaster prepared for the final stage, Terra, the throne world, the seat of the Imperium and the heart of everything the Emperor had built. It would burn, and from its ashes a new order would rise. But first, the Loyalists had to be bled dry. Every remaining legion had to be broken or delayed. The path to Terra had to be paved with the corpses of those still loyal to the Emperor's lie. The heresy was no longer a rebellion. It was an apocalypse, and nothing would remain untouched. The Imperium had been warned. Magnus had tried. The survivors of Istvan had fought to the last to send word. But the warnings had come too late, buried under the weight of disbelief and the sheer scale of the catastrophe. By the time Terra understood what was happening, half the galaxy was already burning. The Emperor remained locked in his war beneath the palace, holding back the demonic tide that Magnus's hubris had unleashed. He could not leave. He could not intervene. The Webway project had become a prison, and the Imperium's only hope was that the scattered Loyalists could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But reinforcements were not coming. The Ultramarines were trapped in Ultramar. The Dark Angels were bleeding in Thramas. The Space Wolves were recovering from Prospero. The Blood Angels had been lured into the Cygnus cluster and ambushed by daemons. The Imperial fists were fortifying Terra, but one legion could not hold against 8. The Salamanders and Raven Guard were shattered, their survivors scattered across the galaxy. Horus had won the opening moves. The board was set, the pieces were in position, and the Warmaster turned his fleets toward Terra. The traitor fleets translated into the Sol system like a plague of iron and fire. They came not as raiders or insurgents, but as an armada of annihilation, hundreds of capital ships flanked by thousands of escorts, troop carriers, and forge vessels. The vengeful spirit led them. Horus's flagship, a cathedral of war crowned with spires and gun decks that could reduce continents to ash. Behind it came the warships of 8 legions, the vessels of the Dark Mechanicum, corrupted Titan barges, and craft whose designs defied Imperial classification ships that bled smoke and ichor whose hulls were inscribed with blasphemies that hurt to perceive. The armada was so vast that it occluded the stars, casting terror into premature twilight. The outer system defenses engaged immediately. Orbital weapons platforms opened fire, lance batteries and nova cannons hurling devastation across the void. Loyalist warships, what few remained after the heresy's scattered campaigns, formed defensive cordons and sold their lives to buy time. The fighting in the void was apocalyptic, ships gutted and burning, debris fields expanding into orbital rings of wreckage. But the traitor fleet was too numerous, too determined, and their ships fought with a fervor that bordered on madness. Daemons walked the decks of traitor vessels, their presence warping reality, ensuring that no wound was truly mortal, no defeat truly final. The defense of Sol was commanded by Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, Praetorian of Terra. He had fortified the system over the months since word of Horus's betrayal reached the throne world, transforming every moon and station into a fortress, every approach vector into a killing ground. But even Dawn's genius could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic. The traitors outnumbered the defenders, and time was on their side. Every day the siege lasted. More reinforcements arrived from the Eye of Terror. Every engagement depleted the loyalist reserves, while the traitors replenished their losses through dark pacts and profane rituals. Terra itself became a fortress unlike any in human history. The imperial palace sprawled across the Himalayan mountain range, its walls layered in adamantium and void shields, its defenses manned by the Adeptus Custodes, the imperial fists, and whatever fragments of loyalist forces had managed to reach the throne world before the noose closed. The civilian population, billions crammed into hive cities and orbital habitats, was mobilized for total war. Factories that had produced consumer goods retooled for ammunition manufacture. Children were conscripted into labor battalions. The elderly were armed and assigned to tertiary defense lines. There was no distinction between combatant and civilian. Everyone on Terra would fight, or everyone would die. The Astronomicon flickered. The Emperor's attention was divided between sustaining the psychic beacon that guided the Imperium and holding shut the breach in the webway. Daemons clawed at the edges of his consciousness, endless and patient, waiting for the moment his will faltered. Malcador stood vigil at the entrance to the Imperial dungeon, sealing the way with psychic wards that burned his soul to maintain. The Emperor could not leave. If he abandoned the webway, Terra would drown in daemons before the traitors even made landfall. If he ceased sustaining the Astronomicon, the Imperium's scattered fleets would be lost in the warp, unable to navigate, unable to coordinate. He was trapped, and Horus knew it. The first landings came at the Eternity Wall spaceport. It was a fortress in its own right. Kilometers of landing pads and defense batteries, garrisoned by regiments of the Imperial Army and elements of the Imperial Fists. The Sons of Horus made planetfall under a rain of fire, their drop pods and assault craft burning through the atmosphere in waves that blotted out the sun. They hit the ground fighting, bolters roaring, chain blades carving through defensive lines. The Imperial defenders fought with the desperation of those protecting their homeworld, but they were mortals facing transhuman demigods, and the casualties were catastrophic. The battle for the spaceport lasted 3 days. The Sons of Horus advanced meter by bloody meter, every corridor contested, every landing pad turned into a killing ground. The defenders mined their own positions and detonated them as the traitors advanced, collapsing entire sections of the structure rather than let them fall intact. But the Sons of Horus did not stop. They could not be stopped. Horus had bred them for this, trained them for this, and now they proved their worth by breaking the first great bastion of Terra's defenses. When the spaceport fell, the traitors had a foothold. Reinforcements poured through, entire companies and armored divisions deploying directly onto Terran soil. The World Eaters arrived howling, their Primarch, a demonic abomination whose presence alone drove mortals mad. The Emperor's children came with banners of obscene beauty, their warriors so lost in sensation that pain and pleasure had become indistinguishable. The Death Guard marched in silence, their armor corroded, their flesh diseased, spreading plague wherever they walked. The word-bearers chanted hymns to the dark gods, summoning daemons into the material plane, turning the battlefield into a spiritual as well as physical war. Rogel Dawn pulled back the inner defenses and began the systematic sacrifice of Terra's outer habs. Entire districts were abandoned, their populations evacuated or armed and told to slow the enemy. The hive cities became vertical battlefields, every level contested, snipers and ambush teams turning the traitors' advance into a grinding war of attrition. The Imperial fists fortified choke points and held them to the last man, each position designed to delay the enemy just long enough for the next fallback position to be prepared. Dawn's strategy was brutal in its clarity. Trade space for time, bleed the enemy at every step, hold the palace until reinforcements arrived. But reinforcements were not coming. The Blood Angels were en route, but they were weeks away. The Dark Angels and Space Wolves were still scattered across the galaxy, prosecuting campaigns that now seemed meaningless compared to the battle for Terra. The Ultramarines were trapped in Ultramar, Guilliman's legion too distant to intervene. Dawn knew this. He also knew that hope was a weapon, and as long as the defenders believed salvation was possible, they would continue to fight. The Lion's Gate was the second great fortress to fall. It was one of the massive gatehouses that pierced the outer walls of the Imperial Palace, a structure so vast that armies could march through it in parade formation. Dawn had fortified it beyond reason, layering defenses until the gate itself was a fortress within a fortress. Manned by entire companies of Imperial fists and supported by Titan legions of the Loyalist Mechanicum, the Iron Warriors were tasked with breaking it. Perturabo brought to bear everything he had learned in a lifetime of siege warfare. He positioned artillery batteries in overlapping fields of fire, bombarding the gate for days without pause, hammering at its void shields until they flickered and failed. His siege engines crawled forward under cover of smoke and lasfire. Breaching charges detonated in calculated sequence to collapse outer defenses without triggering the inner layers too early. The Iron Warriors advanced like a machine, each squad fulfilling its designated role, each casualty anticipated and accounted for in the calculus of victory. The Imperial fists met them with equal discipline. Dawn's sons were masters of defensive warfare, and they had prepared for this moment since the first word of betrayal reached Terra. Every angle of approach was covered by interlocking fire. Every breach was mined or reinforced. The Iron Warriors bled for every meter, their casualties mounting into the thousands, but they did not stop. Perturabo accepted the losses as necessary. This was what the Iron Warriors were built for, to break what could not be broken, regardless of cost. The Titans clashed in the shadow of the Lion's Gate, god machines firing plasma and void weapons at point-blank range, their deaths so catastrophic that entire sections of the gate were vaporized in the detonations. The ground shook with every step. The air burned with every discharge. Princeps died screaming as their machines were cored by lances, their souls incinerated along with their bodies. But the Loyalist Titans were outnumbered, and when the last of them fell, the gate's fate was sealed. Perturabo breached the Lion's Gate on the 16th day of assault. The Iron Warriors poured through the gap, and the outer defenses of the Imperial Palace began to collapse. Dawn pulled his forces back to the inner walls, sealing bulkheads and detonating entire sections of the palace to deny them to the enemy. The retreat was orderly, professional, but it was still a retreat. Terra was losing. The Sanctum Imperialis, the innermost keep of the palace, where the Emperor's throne room stood, became the final bastion. Dawn fortified every approach, every corridor, every stairwell. The Custodes took up positions at the most critical choke points, their guardian spears and auramite armor marking them as the Emperor's ultimate defense. These were warriors who had never known defeat, who had guarded the Emperor since the Unification Wars. But even they bled. Even they fell. Daemons poured through breaches in reality, their forms defying comprehension, their presence corroding the minds of those who looked upon them. The Custodes fought with cold precision, but the tide was unending. The skies above Terra were choked with ash and the wreckage of orbital debris. The traitor fleet held orbital supremacy, bombarding targets of opportunity, dropping more troops with every hour. The planet's surface had become a nightmare landscape, cities burning, mountains reduced to slag, the air toxic with particulates and the stench of corruption. Daemons walked openly now, summoned by word-bearers' rituals, their forms sustained by the psychic screams of the dying. Reality itself was fraying, the line between the warp and the material plane thinning under the weight of so much death and despair. Inside the Imperial dungeon, the Emperor's war continued unseen. He held shut the breach in the webway with one hand and sustained the Astronomicon with the other. His mind stretched across impossibilities, fighting battles on a dozen fronts simultaneously. Demons assaulted him constantly, not with blades but with temptation, despair, and the whispered truth that his empire was already lost. He endured because he had no choice. If he fell, humanity fell with him. Malcador aged visibly with every passing day, his ancient body sustained only by psychic will and the knowledge that he could not fail. He coordinated the defense from the palace's command center, issuing orders, managing logistics, directing reinforcements to collapsing sectors. He barely slept, he barely ate. He was dying by fractions, burning his soul to keep the Imperium alive just a little longer. The defenders fought on, but exhaustion was claiming as many as enemy fire. The Imperial army regiments were down to half strength or less, their ammunition running low, their officers dead or incapacitated. The Imperial fists had suffered appalling casualties. Entire companies reduced to squads. The custodes, who had numbered 10,000 at the siege's beginning, were fewer with each engagement. The walls were breached in a dozen places. The enemy was inside the palace, and still, they held. Then the blood rained from the sky. The demon Primarch Angron descended upon the palace walls at the head of a cornet warband, his wings spreading wide, his body wreathed in fire and blood. He was no longer a Primarch, he was a god of slaughter made manifest, and where he walked, reality screamed. The defenders who looked upon him went mad or died, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. Angron carved through the custodes like they were mortals, his axes splitting auramite armor, his roar shattering stone. Sanguinius met him on the walls. The Primarch of the Blood Angels had arrived at last, his legion having fought their way through the outer system and made planetfall under fire. Sanguinius was radiant even in the midst of hell, his wings white against the crimson sky, his blade gleaming with light that pushed back the darkness. He had seen his own death in visions since childhood, knew this moment had always been coming, and faced it without fear. The duel between the angel and the daemon shook the palace foundations. Angron's strength was inhuman, fueled by Khorne's blessing, his every strike capable of shattering battlements. Sanguinius fought with grace and precision, his blade finding gaps in Angron's defenses, drawing blood that burned like acid. But Angron felt no pain. He felt only rage, endless and consuming, and he pressed forward with the certainty of a force of nature. Sanguinius banished him. It cost the angel nearly everything. He drove his blade through Angron's chest and spoke words of abjuration that burned his throat, channeling psychic force sufficient to cast the daemon Primarch back into the warp. Angron screamed as his form unraveled, his essence dragged back into the Imperium, his warband collapsing without their master. But Sanguinius collapsed as well, his wings broken, his body bleeding from a dozen wounds. The Blood Angels carried their Primarchs from the walls, and the defenders held just a little longer. The siege entered its final days. Supplies were exhausted. Ammunition was rationed. The wounded outnumbered the able. Dawn stood on the walls and looked out at the enemy forces surrounding the palace, hundreds of thousands of traitors, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible, their resolve unbroken. He knew the end was coming. He also knew that they had already succeeded in one regard. They had delayed Horus long enough that the galaxy would remember Terra stood. Then Horus lowered the void shields on the vengeful spirit. The act was broadcast across every channel, impossible to miss. The War Master's flagship, protected by shields and batteries that made it nearly invincible, suddenly went dark. The defenses dropped. The gates opened. It was an invitation, a taunt, a challenge. Horus was calling out the Emperor. Dawn understood immediately what was happening. This was no longer a siege. This was personal. Horus wanted to face his father, to prove his superiority, to break the Emperor not through attrition but through singular combat. It was arrogance born of corruption. The belief that his ascension to Chaos's favor made him the equal of the being who had created him. But it was also an opportunity. If the Emperor could strike at Horus directly, if the Warmaster could be killed, the traitor forces might collapse. The heresy could end here. The Emperor emerged from the Imperial dungeon for the first time since the siege began. He walked through the palace corridors, and every defender who saw him felt a surge of hope so powerful it burned. He was diminished, his strength depleted by months of holding the webway closed, but he was still the Emperor, the master of mankind, the architect of the Imperium. He selected a small strike force to accompany him: Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, and a handful of custodes. They would board the Vengeful Spirit and end this. The teleportation was imprecise, scattered by warp interference and deliberate sabotage. The strike force materialized across different sections of the flagship, separated and vulnerable. Dawn found himself deep in the ship's engineerium, fighting through hordes of traitor Astartes to reach the bridge. The custodes were ambushed by demons, their golden armor tarnished with blasphemous blood. Sanguinius and the Emperor materialized closer to the command deck, and they advanced together through corridors lined with the profane and the corrupt. The Vengeful Spirit had become a cathedral to chaos. The walls were inscribed with sigils that hurt to perceive, the air thick with incense and screams, daemons manifesting in the shadows. Sanguinius fought beside his father, his strength renewed by purpose, his blade carving through every horror that emerged to stop them. They fought through decks saturated with corruption, past chambers where rituals too terrible to name had been enacted, ascending toward the throne room where Horus waited. They reached the bridge. Horus stood at its center, clad in armor that was no longer merely metal but something alive, writhing with runes and eyes that blinked and wept. He was massive, his form enhanced by the blessings of all four gods, his presence so overwhelming that reality bent around him. He looked at Sanguinius and smiled. The angel attacked without hesitation. He knew this was his death. He had seen it. But he would buy his father time, would wound Horus if he could, would prove that even the damned could be resisted. The duel was brief and brutal. Sanguinius's blade struck true, opening wounds in Horus's armor, drawing blood that steamed and hissed. But Horus was beyond pain now, beyond mortality. He caught Sanguinius by the throat and broke him. The angel's spine shattered, his wings crumpled. Horus lifted him like a broken doll and cast him down, the Primarch's body striking the deck with a sound like thunder. Sanguinius tried to rise, tried to speak, but his strength was gone. He looked at the Emperor one final time, and then the light left his eyes. The Emperor looked upon the corpse of his most beloved son and felt something that he had not allowed himself to feel in millennia. Grief, rage, the absolute certainty that this had to end. The Emperor stood over the broken body of Sanguinius and understood that he had already lost. Not the war, not Terra, not even the Imperium, though all of those things hung by threads. He had lost something deeper, the future he had envisioned, the dream of a rational enlightenment spanning the stars, the carefully constructed plan that would have freed humanity from the predations of chaos and elevated it beyond the limitations of flesh and superstition. That future had died long before Sanguinius fell. Perhaps it had died the moment the Primarchs were scattered. Perhaps it had never truly existed at all, nothing more than the hubris of a being who believed he could reshape reality through will and intellect alone. Horus stood before him, transfigured by powers the Emperor had tried to deny existed, empowered by entities he had claimed were mere phantoms of the warp. The Warmaster was no longer entirely human, his form a fusion of gene craft and demonic blessing, his armor alive with the gifts of the ruinous powers. Khorne had granted him strength beyond mortal limitation. Tzeentch had whispered strategies and futures into his mind. Nurgle had made him resilient beyond death. Slaanesh had sharpened his pride into a weapon. He was the chosen of chaos undivided, the mortal who had ascended to stand as their champion, and he looked upon his father with something that might have been pity. The Emperor did not speak. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between them now, no argument that would undo what had been done. This moment had been inevitable since Davin, perhaps since the scattering, perhaps since the first moment the Emperor had decided to create sons rather than tools. He had made beings capable of greatness and given them the capacity for ambition, resentment, and doubt. He had crafted 20 reflections of his own brilliance and then been surprised when they looked into mirrors and questioned why they should serve rather than rule. Horus attacked first. The blow came faster than thought, the Warmaster's talon crackling with warp lightning, reality itself recoiling from the energies channeled through the weapon. The Emperor met it with the Sword of the Emperor, a blade that had ended horrors since the Age of Strife, its edge sharp enough to cut the fabric of the Imperium. The weapons met, and the vengeful spirit screamed, bulkheads warping, gravity fluctuating, the air igniting with psychic discharge. They fought across the bridge and into the corridors beyond, two gods clashing in a space too small to contain them. Horus was faster than he should have been, stronger than any Primarch had ever been, his every strike backed by the infinite malice of the warp. The Emperor parried and countered, his mind processing 1,000 futures simultaneously, calculating angles and probabilities, seeking the opening that would end this. But Horus was no longer bound by causality. The powers he served allowed him to exist in multiple states simultaneously, to strike from angles that did not exist in three-dimensional space. The Emperor's armor cracked. Golden auramite, the finest material ever forged, split under the Warmaster's claws. Blood welled from wounds that should have been impossible to inflict upon his transhuman form. He struck back, the sword carving through Horus's armor, drawing blood that steamed and hissed, but the wounds closed almost immediately, healed by energies that mocked biology and physics alike. Horus spoke for the first time, his voice layered with harmonics that should not have come from a human throat. He spoke of betrayal, of abandonment, of being raised to believe he was essential only to be discarded when the Emperor's true work began. He spoke of the vision shown to him on Davin, the future where the Primarchs were forgotten and the Emperor was worshipped as a god despite his declarations that divinity was a lie. He spoke of the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the fundamental dishonesty of a being who wielded absolute power while demanding humility from his sons. The Emperor did not respond. He could have explained. He could have revealed the necessity behind his choices, the existential threats that required secrecy, the calculations that justified every seeming betrayal. But words were meaningless now. Horus had been shown a truth wrapped in lies by entities whose sole purpose was the corruption of all things, and no argument could undo the poison that had taken root. They fought through chambers where reality had ceased to function properly, where the walls bled and the air screamed with voices that had never been human. Daemons manifested and were annihilated by the backwash of power from the duel, their essence scattered before they could fully coalesce. The vengeful spirit was dying around them, its structure unable to withstand the forces being unleashed within its hull. Horus drove his talon through the Emperor's chest. The blow punched through auramite and bone, tearing into organs that had sustained the master of mankind for 40,000 years. The Emperor staggered, his strength failing, his vision darkening at the edges. Horus lifted him, savoring the moment, the absolute confirmation of his ascension. He had done what no being in history had ever accomplished. He had broken the Emperor of mankind. And then he hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but it was there. Some fragment of the man Horus had been looked out through the eyes of the thing he had become, and saw not an enemy but his father, broken and bleeding, defeated. That fragment asked a question that chaos could not answer. What now? Victory was hollow, if there was no one left to acknowledge it. Power was meaningless if the one whose approval he had always sought was dead. The Emperor saw the hesitation. He looked into Horus's eyes and recognized the doubt, the last remnant of his son buried beneath layers of corruption and demonic influence. And he understood that this fragment could not be saved. To reach it, to purge the corruption and restore what Horus had been, would require severing Horus from the powers that sustained him. It would kill him. There was no salvation, only the choice between mercy and necessity. The Emperor chose necessity. He unleashed the totality of his psychic might, not in a focused strike, but as an absolute erasure. His power flowed into Horus, not targeting the body, but the soul, burning through the layers of demonic blessing, scouring away the gifts of chaos, stripping the War Master down to his fundamental essence. Horus screamed, his voice cracking across octaves, the powers that had elevated him fleeing back into the warp in self-preservation. The armor cracked and fell away. The enhancements dissolved. The strength and resilience that chaos had granted evaporated like morning dew. What remained was Horus Lupercal, the first son, the War Master, stripped bare and dying. He looked at his father one final time, clarity returning to his eyes, and what the Emperor saw there was worse than hatred or defiance. It was understanding. Horus knew what he had done. He knew what he had become. He knew that there was no forgiveness possible, no redemption that could undo the deaths of millions and the shattering of the Imperium. He had been shown a lie and believed it, and that belief had doomed the galaxy. He tried to speak. Blood filled his mouth. The Emperor did not let him finish. With the last of his strength, he obliterated Horus's soul, burning it from existence so completely that not even the ruinous powers could reclaim it. Horus Lupercal ceased to exist, not merely dead but erased, his essence scattered into nothingness. The body collapsed, empty and lifeless. The Emperor fell beside it. His body was ruined beyond any hope of recovery. The wound in his chest was mortal even for a being of his power. His spine was shattered, his organs were failing, psychic energy leaked from him like blood, his essence bleeding into the warp as his physical form collapsed. He had won, but the victory had cost him everything. Rogel Dawn found him there, surrounded by the ashes of Horus and the wreckage of the bridge. The Praetorian of Terra, who had never shown emotion in living memory, wept as he lifted his father's broken form. The Custodes who had survived the boarding gathered around their master, their purpose suddenly uncertain. The Emperor had been the axis around which the Imperium turned. Without him, what was any of this for? They teleported back to Terra. The Medicae and tech priests swarmed immediately, but their diagnostics were redundant. Everyone could see that the Emperor was dying. His body could not be saved, but his mind, his psychic essence, could perhaps be preserved. The Golden Throne had been prepared for this contingency, though none had believed it would be necessary. It had been designed as an interface for the Webway project, a psychic amplifier to allow the Emperor to navigate and control the ancient Eldar pathways. Now it would become his prison and his life support, a machine that would sustain his consciousness while his body decayed into a corpse that could not die. Malcador the Sigillite made the choice. The Emperor was too weak to resist, too damaged to argue. They bore him to the throne, seated him upon the golden seat, and activated the mechanisms that would bind his soul to the device. The pain was immediate and absolute, every nerve ending in his body igniting, but it was necessary. The Astronomicon had to be sustained. The breach in the Webway had to be held closed. If the Emperor died completely, Terra would fall to daemons within hours, and the Imperium would be consumed by warp storms within weeks. Malcador took the Emperor's place, holding the breach for the brief hours required to complete the installation. It burned him from the inside out, aging him millennia in moments, his ancient body crumbling to ash as his soul was consumed in the effort. He died with a smile, knowing he had bought his oldest friend the time needed to be enthroned. His last words were lost to history, spoken only to the Emperor, who could no longer respond. The Emperor of mankind became the Carrion Lord, the Corpse God, the thing that sat upon the Golden Throne and would sit there for 10,000 years, unable to speak, unable to move, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day, whose souls were fed into the machinery to keep his essence from dissipating entirely. The heresy did not end with Horus's death. It metastasized. The traitor legions, leaderless and scattered, turned on each other in the confusion. Some continued to assault Terra, unaware that their War Master had fallen. Others fled into the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that had consumed entire sectors during the heresy's height. The Blood Angels, learning of Sanguinius's death, descended into a rage so profound that they slaughtered everything in their path, traitor and civilian alike, painting entire districts red before their madness subsided. Rogel Dawn led the defense with mechanical precision, coordinating counterattacks, driving the traitors from Terra's soil one blood-soaked meter at a time. The siege broke not with a climactic battle but with exhaustion and attrition. The traitors had lost their figurehead. The daemons were recalled to the warp as the psychic storm feeding them dissipated. The dark mechanicum vessels began to malfunction, their corrupted machine spirits turning on their crews. Within weeks, the traitor fleet had scattered, fleeing into the outer system and beyond, hounded by what remained of the loyalist navy. Terra had survived, but it was a hollow victory. The planet was scarred beyond recognition, entire continents reduced to ash, billions dead. The Imperial Palace a fortress built on corpses. The Astronomicon still burned, but it was dimmer now, sustained by the Emperor's fading will and the daily sacrifice of psychers rounded up from across the Imperium. The dream of the Imperial truth was dead. The survivors did not speak of reason or enlightenment. They spoke only of endurance. The scouring began immediately. This was the Imperial response to the heresy, a campaign of extermination aimed at purging every last traitor from the galaxy. It lasted 7 years and consumed resources the Imperium could not afford to spend, but there was no choice. The traitors could not be allowed to regroup, to rebuild, to threaten Terra again. Guilliman emerged from Ultramar with what remained of his legion and led the prosecution. His tactical genius turned toward the systematic destruction of traitor strongholds. The traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terra, that vast wound in reality where the warp bled into the material plane without restraint. There, they built new empires, daemon worlds where the laws of physics were suggestions and reality bent to the will of the dark gods. They did not die. They endured, twisted and transformed, plotting their return, waging the long war that would continue for 10,000 years. Prospero was declared a dead world, its libraries reduced to ash, its population scattered or slain. The 1,000 Suns, transformed into sorcerous abominations, followed Magnus into the Eye of Terra, establishing the planet of sorcerers where they continued their studies, bitter and broken. The Space Wolves returned to Fenris, their reputation as the Emperor's executioners secured, though Leman Russ would disappear into the warp centuries later, seeking forgiveness or redemption or perhaps just an ending. The Night Lords scattered into the void, becoming pirates and raiders, their philosophy of terror validated by the Imperium's descent into tyranny. Konrad Kurze was eventually hunted down and executed by an Imperial assassin, accepting his death without resistance, vindicated in his belief that the Imperium was damned and justice was a lie. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was unrecognizable. The Imperial truth was abandoned, replaced by the Imperial cult, a galaxy-spanning religion that worshipped the Emperor as divine despite his explicit denials. Lorgar's vision had come to pass. The God Emperor was enshrined as the object of absolute devotion, his martyrdom on the Golden Throne transforming him into the central figure of a faith more powerful than any he had tried to suppress. The ecclesiarchy rose to administer this faith, its priests wielding power that rivaled the administratum itself. The Codex Astartes was written by Guilliman, a tome of doctrine that restructured the legions into chapters, limiting each to 1,000 warriors to prevent any single commander from wielding the power Horus had. The great legions were broken into successor chapters, their identities fractured, their brotherhood diluted. Some, like the Space Wolves and the Black Templars, resisted the Codex and remained outside its strictures. Most complied, seeing the wisdom in preventing another war master from ever arising. The Inquisition was founded to ensure that the mistakes of the heresy could never be repeated. It was given absolute authority to investigate, judge, and execute any suspected of heresy or corruption. Its agents operated above the law, answerable only to themselves and the Emperor's will as they interpreted it. The Inquisition became the Imperium's immune system, cutting out infection with ruthless efficiency, but also prone to excess, to paranoia, to seeing corruption where there was only dissent. The Adeptus Mechanicus, shattered by civil war, retreated into orthodoxy. Innovation was declared heresy. The pursuit of knowledge was restricted to the recovery of ancient technologies, not the creation of new ones. The Dark Age of technology became a myth, its wonders forbidden, its secrets buried under layers of ritual and superstition. The Mechanicum became a priesthood of maintenance, worshipping machines they no longer understood, performing rites they believed were prayers but were simply technical procedures whose meanings had been forgotten. The Imperium calcified. Where, once it had been expansionist and dynamic, it became static and defensive. The Great Crusade was replaced by endless holding actions, the reconquest of lost worlds, the suppression of rebellions. Humanity spread across 1,000,000 worlds, but it did not advance. It endured. Progress was heresy, innovation was corruption. The only virtue was obedience, the only truth was faith, and the only goal was survival for one more day. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne and dreamed. His consciousness drifted across the galaxy, touching the minds of billions, guiding the Astronomicon, holding shut the breach in the webway, fighting an endless war against demons that clawed at the edges of his awareness. He could not speak. He could not move. He could not die. Every day, 1,000 psychers were sacrificed to sustain him, their souls fed into the mechanisms of the throne, burning out in moments to buy him a little more time. Some believed he was already dead, that what sat on the throne was just a corpse, animated by machinery and the collective faith of humanity. Others believed he was becoming something new, ascending into true godhood through the worship of trillions, transforming into the divine being he had always denied he was. The truth was unknowable. The Emperor's mind was so vast, so fractured, so distributed across space and consciousness, that perhaps even he no longer knew what he was. The Primarchs who survived were scattered. Guilliman established Ultramar as a semi-autonomous realm and governed it with the efficiency that had always defined him, but even he could not hold back the bureaucratic rot consuming the Imperium. He would eventually be mortally wounded and placed in stasis, neither alive nor dead, preserved in the hope that one day he could be healed. Rogel Dawn continued to fortify Terra, building defenses upon defenses, never satisfied that the throne world was secure. He would disappear in a battle against traitors, his body never recovered, his fate uncertain. The Lion returned to Caliban to find that his homeworld had turned traitor in his absence, his own legion split between loyalist and rebel. The battle that followed destroyed the planet, shattering it into fragments. The Lion survived but fell into a coma, hidden within the rock, the remnant of Caliban that became the Dark Angel's fortress monastery. His warriors spent the next 10,000 years hunting the fallen, the traitors from their own legion, seeking redemption for a betrayal they had not committed. Vulcan vanished, leaving behind artifacts and prophecies, promises that he would return when humanity needed him most. Corax fled into the Eye of Terror, hunting the traitors in their own realm, becoming something other than human in the process. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars disappeared into the webway, pursuing Dark Eldar raiders, and never returned. Lehman Russ walked into the Eye of Terror seeking the Tree of Life, vowing he would return for the final battle. None have been seen since. The Blood Angels were cursed. Sanguinius's death left a psychic wound in the Legion's gene seed, a flaw that manifested as the Black Rage, a madness where battle brothers relived their Primarchs' final moments and descended into berserk fury. They hid the flaw for millennia, terrified that the Inquisition would declare them corrupted and order their extermination. Every Blood Angel knew that one day they would succumb, that their nobility and discipline would be stripped away, and they would die screaming in the grip of a rage they could not control. The Imperium became a machine fueled by faith and fear. The Administratum grew into a bureaucracy so vast that entire sectors could be lost in its records, their tithes forgotten, their rebellions unnoticed for decades. Entire worlds existed only as entries in ledgers, their population's numbers to be requisitioned and expended. The Imperial Guard became the Imperium's primary military force. Mortal soldiers armed with mass-produced weapons, sent to die in wars whose purposes they rarely understood, their lives valued only in aggregate. Humanity spread, but did not thrive. Hive worlds held trillions in squalor and darkness, their populations never seeing sunlight, toiling in factories that produced munitions for wars they would never see. Agri-worlds were stripped to feed the hives, their ecosystems destroyed, their soil exhausted and salted. Forge worlds consumed themselves, refining metals and manufacturing war machines until the planets were nothing but industrial wastelands. Death worlds held populations that existed only to supply recruits for the Astartes, cultures built around survival and martial prowess, their people expendable feedstock for the war machine. The warp grew worse. The Eye of Terror expanded slowly, consuming systems at its edge, transforming them into demon worlds or dead space. Warp storms became more frequent, isolating sectors for years or centuries, cutting them off from the Astronomicon and leaving them vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. Navigators reported that travel was becoming more dangerous, that the currents of the Imperium were more turbulent, that things moved in the deep warp that had not been there before. Chaos cults spread like disease. On every world, in every hive, there were those who turned to the ruinous powers out of desperation or ambition or simple madness. They worshipped in secret, performed rituals that should not work but did, summoned demons that should not exist but manifested anyway. The Inquisition burned them when it found them, but for every cult destroyed, 3 more arose. The powers were patient. They had eternity. They could wait. Xenos threats multiplied. The Orcs remained a constant plague, their warbands appearing wherever humanity was weak, their love of violence and war ensuring they would never be truly eradicated. The Eldar watched from their craft worlds, a dying race whose empire had birthed Slaanesh, seeing in humanity the same hubris that had destroyed them. The Necrons began to wake from their 60-million-year slumber, ancient machines whose technology made the Imperium seem primitive, reclaiming tomb worlds and exterminating the humans who had settled there. The Tyranids arrived from beyond the galaxy, a swarm intelligence that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of biomass, leaving nothing but lifeless rock. And through it all, the Emperor burned. 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. 10,000 years of agony, of psychic war against daemons that never relented, of guiding the Astronomicon through the warp's currents, of holding shut a breach that could never be properly sealed. 1,000 psychers every day, their souls screaming as they were consumed, their essences feeding the machinery that kept him alive. Some calculated that the Emperor had consumed more human souls than all the wars of the Imperium combined, that his existence required a sacrifice more terrible than anything chaos had ever demanded, but he endured. Because if he failed, the Imperium fell. If the Astronomicon went dark, the Imperium's fleets would be lost in the warp, unable to navigate, stranded, or consumed. If the breach in the webway opened fully, Terra would drown in demons, and the cradle of humanity would become another demon world. His suffering was the price of survival, and he paid it every second of every day for 10,000 years. The Imperium he had envisioned rational, enlightened, free from superstition, had become the opposite of everything he intended. It was theocratic, stagnant, built on faith and fear. Trillions prayed to him as a god while he sat powerless to reject their worship. The imperial truth had been replaced by the imperial creed, and that creed was absolute. To deny the emperor's divinity was heresy. To question the ecclesiarchy was treason. To seek knowledge outside approved boundaries was corruption. But perhaps that was always inevitable. Perhaps the heresy had only accelerated what was always going to happen. Humanity was not ready for the truth he had tried to give them. They needed myths, needed faith, needed something absolute to believe in when the galaxy was so hostile and uncaring. The imperial cult gave them that, even if it was built on lies. It sustained them, it gave meaning to their suffering, and perhaps that was enough. The wound had never closed. The heresy was not a historical event, but an ongoing catastrophe, a fracture in the Imperium's foundation that could never be repaired. Every doctrine, every institution, every ritual was shaped by that ancient betrayal. The splitting of the legions, the paranoia of the Inquisition, the worship of the Emperor, the prohibition on innovation, the endless wars. All of it traced back to Horus's fall and the Emperor's internment. The traitor legions still launched black crusades from the Eye of Terror, attempting to finish what Horus had started. Abaddon the Despoiler, Horus's successor as War Master of Chaos, led 13 such crusades over 10,000 years, each one bringing the traitors closer to Terra, each one bleeding the Imperium a little more. Cadia, the fortress world guarding the Eye of Terror, held against all of them, a monument to defiance, proof that even the damned could be resisted. Until finally, in the 13th Crusade, Cadia fell, and the galaxy was split by the Cicatrix Maledictum, a warp rift that cut the Imperium in half. But that was in the far future. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, there was only exhaustion and grief. The Imperium had survived, but it had lost everything that made survival worthwhile. The Emperor's dream was dead. His sons were dead or scattered. His empire had become a theocratic nightmare. And he sat upon the golden throne, unable to speak, unable to act, able only to suffer and endure, while the galaxy slowly consumed itself. There were no victories in the 41st millennium. There was only war. The Imperium fought on every front against enemies that could never be fully defeated, its resources depleted, its infrastructure crumbling, its population sustained only by faith in a god who had denied his divinity and by the sacrifice of a corpse that could not die. The Emperor remained. The throne remained. The Imperium remained. Not because they were strong, not because they were just, but because the alternative was extinction, and humanity had never learned how to surrender. They would fight until the last world burned, the last soldier fell, the last prayer was spoken. They would endure because endurance was all they had left, and in the depths of the Golden Throne, the Emperor dreamed of what might have been, of sons who had not fallen, of a future where reason triumphed over superstition, of an Imperium that spread not through conquest, but enlightenment. He dreamed of Horus, his favored son, standing beside him not as a traitor but as a partner. He dreamed of Magnus pursuing knowledge without corruption. He dreamed of a humanity freed from the warp's predations, safe within the webway, ascending to something greater. But dreams were all he had. Reality was the throne, the pain, the endless war, the slow decay of everything he had built. Reality was the Imperium dying by inches, sustained only by rituals whose meanings had been forgotten and faith in a god who had never wanted to be worshipped. The heresy was over. The wound remained. And the Imperium, built on the ashes of the Emperor's dream, would endure for 10,000 years not because it was mighty, but because it was too stubborn to die. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And it began here, in the moment Horus fell and the Emperor was enthroned. Everything that followed was echo and consequence. The galaxy shaped forever by a betrayal so profound that its scars would never heal. The Emperor burns. The Imperium bleeds. The war continues.